You know, crowds don't make me nervous. This time I went to this event, and I'm sitting there with the promoter, and I could feel the energy of the crowd. You know, and I said to the promoter, you know, I get the feeling that when this is over, they're all going to want to come down.
Danilee Kelly Norris is breaking her silence, and what she's revealing will change everything you thought you knew.
My whole life is focused on keeping her as well as I possibly can. You know, I've had to give up my film career, like I'm fortunate enough to have, to be able to get these things done. And so it's really frustrating.
For 24 years, a piece of a family's story was locked away. A secret so carefully hidden that nobody even knew it existed, until now. And what she's revealing doesn't just add a new detail. It shifts the entire story in a way no one expected. And today, that silence is shattered. For the first time in 24 years, the truth steps out of the shadows, and it's more jaw-dropping than anyone could have imagined. The boy no one saw coming. His own autobiography opens with a single line that tells you everything you need to know about the life that shaped him. He wrote that nothing ever came easy for him, not even being born. That was not an exaggeration. Carlos Ray Norris came into the world in Ryan, Oklahoma in 1940, and he came in struggling, what doctors call a blue baby, fighting for air from his very first moment on Earth. It was a small detail he carried quietly for decades, a private symbol of everything that would follow. A life where survival was never handed to you and every step forward had to be earned. Ryan, Oklahoma, in 1940, was the kind of place that taught children early that the world owed them nothing. Dusty roads, tight money, families held together by will more than by comfort. Chuck was the oldest of 3 boys born to Ray and Wilma Norris, Irish and Cherokee blood running through him in equal measure, a heritage he would carry with quiet pride for the rest of his life. But pride was hard to find in those early years. His father, Ray, was a mechanic and a truck driver, a man who turned his hands to whatever work was available. He was also an alcoholic, not the quiet kind, the kind that disappears, the kind that makes a household feel permanently unsteady. Chuck has described the shyness he developed as a child as something that went far beyond ordinary introversion. He called it debilitating, the kind that is not born from personality, but from shame, from watching your father be someone the neighborhood talks about, from never being entirely sure what you were coming home to. When Chuck was 16, his parents divorced, and his father walked out of his son's life almost completely. The man who would grow up to become the world's most recognizable symbol of protective fatherhood grew up with a father who was barely present at all. That kind of wound does not close neatly. It travels with you through every relationship, every success, every quiet moment when the noise stops, and the truth has room to breathe. It shapes how you love, how fiercely you protect. How hard do you work to become the opposite of the thing that once hurt you? After the divorce, Chuck's mother, Wilma, moved the boys first to Prairie Village in Kansas and then out to Torrance in California. New school, new town. Again. He enrolled at North Torrance High School as the new kid he had always been. Shy, slightly built, not athletic. By his own honest description, not someone who stood out in any particular way. Nobody looking at Carlos Ray Norris in 1956 would have predicted what was coming. In 1958, he joined the United States Air Force as an air policeman and was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea. It was there, far from home, and the life that had always felt unsteady, that a Korean instructor introduced him to Tang Soo-do. Something came alive in him the moment he started training. Not just physically, though the physical transformation was real and dramatic. It was the architecture of the discipline itself that changed him. The idea that the body could be trained. That weakness was not a permanent condition. That a boy who had spent his whole life feeling invisible and ungrounded could become someone who could not be knocked down easily. He trained with an obsessiveness that surprised everyone around him. When he was discharged in 1962, he opened his own karate school in Torrance. Celebrity clients started arriving. Steve McQueen trained with him. Bob Barker trained with him. Priscilla Presley walked through the door. The Osmonds, Donnie and Marie. When financial trouble threatened to close his schools, McQueen pulled him aside and told him to think seriously about acting. Chuck laughed the idea off. He was a martial artist, not a performer. But when the schools finally did close, and that door shut completely behind him, he remembered what McQueen said and walked through a different one. He was in his mid-30s when he made his first film. An age when most people have long since decided who they are and what their life is going to look like. He had barely started. But before the world would learn his name, a young Bruce Lee was about to put him in front of a camera in a fight scene that would launch both of their legends. And what Chuck agreed to in that scene, quietly and without negotiation, would say something important about the kind of man he actually was underneath the image being built around him. The legend the world worshipped. In 1972, Bruce Lee invited Chuck Norris to play the villain in The Way of the Dragon. Their fight scene, staged inside the Roman Colosseum, became one of the most iconic sequences in the history of martial arts films. It is also the scene where Chuck loses. Bruce Lee wins. Chuck said yes without asking for a rewrite. He did not negotiate a different ending. He took the role, lost the on-screen fight, and walked away with a reputation for being someone who understood that honest work mattered more than always being the last man standing. That quiet self-assurance became his signature, and it was the very thing that made audiences trust him completely. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, Chuck Norris became the face of a particular version of American toughness, missing in action. The Delta Force, Code of Silence, Lone Wolf McQuade. These were not just action films, they were cultural moments. At a time when America was still processing Vietnam, still searching for its identity, Chuck Norris offered something uncomplicated and direct. A man who fought for what was right and won. No winking at the camera. No self-aware irony. Just a stillness that felt completely genuine. Audiences did not just enjoy it. They trusted it. By 1993, when Walker, Texas Ranger premiered, he had moved beyond popularity into something deeper. He was embedded in the American consciousness. The show ran for 9 seasons, more than 200 episodes, and was broadcast in over 90 countries. Cordell Walker was Chuck Norris, with a badge, moral, unshakable, and impossible to corrupt. And people did not simply watch the show. They believed in it. Children wanted to grow up to be him. Then the internet arrived and turned him into something else entirely. The Chuck Norris facts began circulating online in the early 2000s, absurd hyperbolic statements about his impossible toughness that spread across every corner of the early internet. He had nothing to do with creating them. He found them genuinely funny. He leaned in gently, signed some book deals on the back of the phenomenon, and let the mythology grow. By that point, separating the man from the myth had become nearly impossible for anyone on the outside. But there is a detail that most people walked straight past during all those years of fame and legend building. In 1991, a young woman reached out to Chuck Norris with a truth he had not anticipated. She was 26 years old, and she was his daughter. born in 1964 from a brief relationship during his first marriage. Chuck had not known she existed. When she made contact, he could have handled it quietly, legally, at arm's length. He did not. He met her. He welcomed her into his life. He publicly acknowledged her in his 2004 memoir, and she became part of his family. To anyone paying closer attention, it was a window into the man behind the armor. Someone who, when confronted with a complicated and inconvenient truth, chose love over reputation management. That choice would turn out to be characteristic. That same instinct showed up again in 1997 when Chuck met Gina O'Kelly, a former model, 23 years younger than him, warm and faith-driven and genuinely uninterested in the machinery of celebrity. They married in November 1998. Chuck was 58 years old. He had 2 adult sons from his first marriage. Most men at that stage of life think about slowing down. In 2001, Gina gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, Dakota and Danilee. Chuck Norris was 61 years old when he became a father to newborns. To the outside world, it read as a heartwarming footnote to an already extraordinary life. A legend getting a second act as a father. Sweet, touching, easy to file away and move past. But inside that family, something far more deliberate was beginning to take shape. Something that would not become visible to the rest of the world for another 24 years. Because in the moment those 2 babies arrived, Chuck Norris made a choice that almost no one noticed. He decided to step back from the spotlight. Not completely, but deliberately and significantly. And what he poured himself into instead, behind those closed doors, away from every camera, became the real story of the last quarter century of his life. The secret life he chose to guard. There is a photograph that Danilee shared after her father died. In it, Chuck Norris is holding her as a newborn. His hands, the same hands that built an entire career on delivering force and impact, are cradling her with a gentleness that seems almost physically impossible, given everything the world knows about those hands. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at her. Only at her. That is the image that contains the secret. When the twins were born in 2001, Chuck was at the absolute peak of his cultural relevance. Walker, Texas Ranger, was still airing. His name was on billboards and in memes and in the cultural bloodstream of an entire generation. He could have leaned into all of it. He could have brought the family along for the ride, put the babies in magazine spreads, turned fatherhood into another branch of the Chuck Norris brand. He did none of that. Instead, he pulled back. Deliberately, intentionally, and almost entirely. He turned down work. He declined appearances. He moved the family to a ranch in Navasota, Texas, well away from Hollywood and the entertainment industry and the constant noise that had surrounded him for 30 years. He wanted to be home. He wanted to be present, not as a public figure performing fatherhood, as a father actually doing it. And this is the part that most of the obituaries missed entirely. Chuck Norris's decision to step back from public life when the twins arrived was not simply a lifestyle choice. It was a quiet, deliberate act of personal redemption. It was the most important thing he ever did, and he did it entirely without an audience. He had grown up with a father who was absent, an alcoholic, who disappeared from his sons' lives and left a wound that Chuck spent decades training around, competing around, building that famous iron exterior around. He knew from the inside exactly what it felt like to be a child who needed a father and found empty space instead. He had lived that specific loneliness. It had shaped everything about him: the shyness, the relentless drive, the need to prove something to a man who was no longer there to see it. And when Danilee and Dakota arrived at 61, something in him made a silent decision. Not to the cameras, not to the fans, to those two babies. That they would never know that particular kind of absence. That they would never have to wonder where he was or whether he was coming back. That the thing that had broken something in him as a child would stop with his generation and not travel any further. He showed up for everything. The school events, the bedtime routines, the small, unglamorous, invisible hours that never appear in highlight reels but are the exact hours that make children feel genuinely safe in the world. He taught them about faith, not the performed kind meant for cameras, but the quiet, private kind that gets you through actual difficulty. He talked to them about resilience, not as an abstract ideal, but as something you practice every day, whether anyone is watching or not. But the private world he had so carefully constructed for his family was not without its own serious crisis. In 2013, Gina began experiencing alarming and frightening symptoms following 3 contrast-enhanced MRI scans conducted over the course of a single week. She had been tested for rheumatoid arthritis. What developed afterward was something far more devastating. She described it as acid burning across her skin, spreading slowly through her body. She visited emergency rooms repeatedly, going through nights of violent shaking and cognitive breakdown and muscle wasting so severe that doctors were testing her for ALS, MS, cancer, and Parkinson's disease before anyone connected the deterioration to the MRI contrast agent she had received. Chuck sat beside his wife in hospital rooms and watched her deteriorate in front of him. He later described it publicly during a CBS News interview in 2017, saying she was dying right in front of him and that he felt completely helpless to stop it. The man the world called unbreakable was sitting in a hospital room terrified, watching the person he loved most fight for her health. They spent $2 million across 3 years on Gina's medical care. Treatment centers in China, a clinic in Nevada, specialists in Houston. In 2017, Chuck filed a $10 million lawsuit against 11 pharmaceutical and medical companies, alleging that the gadolinium-based contrast agent used in Gina's scans had caused lasting damage that the manufacturers had failed to properly warn patients about. The lawsuit was eventually dropped without a settlement, but the fight itself and the fear behind it was completely real. Danilee and Dakota were 12 years old when their mother's health crisis began. They watched their father navigate that period not with combat skills or physical toughness, but with something quieter and more demanding. Patience, constancy, the willingness to sit in difficulty without leaving. They watched him become a caregiver, a researcher, a man who flew his wife across the world to find help, rather than accept that no help existed. That was the education those children actually received growing up in that house. Not how to fight, not how to project an image of invincibility, how to stay, how to love someone through something long and hard and frightening, how to be a safe person for the people who depend on you, even when you are scared yourself. And then, on a morning in March 2026, with 9 days having passed since that birthday sparring video had made the whole world believe he was still untouchable, something happened on the island of Kauai. The family that had been his greatest and most private achievement was about to face the one thing he had never been able to train against, plan around, or fight his way past. When everything changed, March 10, 2026. Chuck Norris turned 86 years old. To celebrate, he posted a video of himself in Hawaii, sparring with a trainer in the sunshine. His movements were controlled and deliberate. His hands still knew exactly where to go. He grinned at the camera and wrote something about not aging, about leveling up, about gratitude, and another year and a life he was still fully choosing to live. The internet did exactly what it always did with Chuck Norris. Millions of people shared it. Millions more laughed and nodded and took it as confirmation of something they had always privately believed, that this particular man was simply built differently from the rest of us. 9 days later, a close friend who had spoken with him by phone that Wednesday described him as upbeat and in good spirits, cracking jokes, sounding exactly like himself. And then something happened on Kauai. The family has chosen not to say what, and that choice deserves complete respect. What is known is this: Chuck owned a home on Kauai's North Shore, a place he had come to love, where the pace of life was slower, and the ocean was always visible from the property. He was brought to Wilcox Medical Center in Lihue, the island's main hospital, following a medical emergency. The first reports reached the media on March 19th, and they initially described him as alert and recovering. The next morning, the family released a statement. They described his death as sudden. They said he had been surrounded by family and that he was at peace. They asked for privacy in the days ahead. And they described him, in the statement, not as the world's greatest martial artist or the most famous action star of his generation, but as a devoted husband, a loving father, a caring grandfather, and the heart of their family. The heart of their family. Not the legend. The heart. Word traveled around the globe within hours. Flowers appeared at his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Sylvester Stallone posted from the set of The Expendables 2. Jean-Claude Van Damme wrote about losing a friend he had known from the very beginning. Dolph Lundgren honored him publicly. Veterans organizations held moments of silence. Politicians issued formal statements. Fans who had never met him but who had grown up with his face on their television screens and his values woven into their understanding of what a good man looked like, sat in their homes and grieved genuinely. The world mourned Chuck Norris, the icon, with everything it had. But inside a family that had spent 24 years living a life the cameras never captured, 5 children were mourning something that no tribute montage or Hollywood statement could fully reach. They were not grieving a legend. They were grieving the person who showed up, the person who stayed, the man who had made sure they never, not once in their entire lives, had to wonder whether he was coming home. Most people expected the twins to stay silent. They had been raised in privacy, kept deliberately out of the spotlight, never turned into supporting cast members in someone else's celebrity narrative. But within days of the announcement, Danilee Kelly Norris opened her phone and began to type. And for the first time in 24 years, she told the world who her father actually was. Then Danilee finally speaks. She began with the truth about what she was feeling. She wrote that she did not think grief was a strong enough word to describe what her family was going through. That losing a parent is the kind of thing you are never actually prepared for, no matter how much you think you might be, no matter how long or how well you have known the person. And then, before asking for the privacy she clearly needed, she did something that 24 years of deliberate quiet had not prepared anyone to expect. She started describing her father, the real one, the one behind the legend. She said her father had been her protector, that from the moment she was born and he took her into his arms, she had been his little girl, not a title, not a performance, a fact that was simply always true, woven into the basic fabric of who she was and how she understood herself in the world. She posted photographs alongside the words. In the first, Chuck is holding her as a newborn, those enormous fighter's hands wrapped around her with an almost impossible gentleness. In another, the two of them are sitting close together on a beach, comfortable and at ease in the way you only are with someone you have never once had a real reason to doubt. In another image, Danilee, as a grown adult, is asleep on his lap, curled against him the way a person curls against someone they have trusted completely from the very beginning of their life. These were not publicity photographs. Nobody had styled them or planned them or cleared them with a publicist. They were the images of a life lived entirely in private, offered to the world for the first time because the person who had made that privacy possible was no longer there to protect it. She wrote about the tenderness he brought to every relationship in his life, how deeply he loved and how carefully. She said he cared for every single person in his life with a quality that she could only describe as pure tenderness. And then she said something that cut straight through 50 years of mythology in a single sentence. She acknowledged that her father had a warrior exterior. She said those exact words, warrior exterior, freely and without apology, because she had watched it her whole life and knew exactly what it was. But she said his heart, the actual heart inside the warrior, was so completely full of love that it almost defied what the world thought it knew about him. And she said that love was something both her parents had passed down to her deliberately, something they had worked to plant in her as a permanent part of who she was. Then she said the thing that stopped everyone who read it. She called him her safe person for all 24 years of her life. Her safe person, not her hero, not her idol, not the legend she had grown up knowing the whole world worshipped. Her safe person, the word a child uses not for the strongest individual they know, but for the most consistently present one. The one you go to when the world feels like too much. The one whose arms you trust completely without needing to think about it. Chuck Norris, the man the entire world called unbreakable and unkillable, was known to his own daughter by the quietest, most human word in the language. Safe. She went further. She talked about gratitude, about the specific wisdom he had pressed into her over the course of those 24 years, not in grand speeches, but in the ordinary fabric of daily life. She said he had pushed her not to shy away from things that seemed impossible, that his constant compassion had taught her how to love herself, that his support for everything she cared about had never wavered even once. She made him a promise at the end. The kind of promise you make when grief is still raw, and the loss is so enormous you need to give it somewhere to go. She told him she would always try to make him proud, and then she added the detail that changes how you read the whole tribute. She said he had already told her every single day while he was alive that making him proud was simply impossible not to do. Every day. He told her that every day. In the quiet of an ordinary morning, in the house the world never saw, the toughest man the world had ever decided to believe in told his daughter she was already enough. More than enough. Not once. Every day. Her twin brother, Dakota, posted his own tribute separately. He kept it honest and plain and completely devastating in the way that the simplest things always are. He described Chuck as the man he had looked up to his entire life. He spoke about his father's generosity and kindness and faith and discipline, all the qualities people had publicly admired for decades, but he named them from the inside, as a son who had actually lived inside that example rather than watched it from a distance. He called Chuck the finest man he had ever known. Not the toughest, not the most famous. The finest man he had ever known. And that is the story that Danilee's words, Dakota's words, and 24 years of deliberate silence finally revealed to the world. The boy born in Ryan, Oklahoma, who grew up watching his father disappear, spent 60 years building an image of absolute invincibility around a wound that never fully healed. And then, at 61, when two babies arrived and handed him one final chance to do the thing his own father never did, he chose completely differently. He walked away from the cameras. He went home. He showed up every single day. He became, in total secrecy and with no audience at all, everything he had needed as a child and never been given. That is the story underneath the legend. Not Walker, Texas Ranger. Not the roundhouse kick. Not the memes that made him immortal online. A father who decided that his most important performance would have no audience except the two people who needed him most. Chuck Norris trained every day for 9 days before he died. He posted a birthday video on March 10 that looked like a man who had genuinely beaten time itself. And then he was gone, suddenly and quietly, on a peaceful island, surrounded by the family that had always known the truth about him. The one he had guarded from the world with more care and discipline than anything else he ever protected. The world thought it knew Chuck Norris. It knew the legend. It knew the image. It knew the myth that had been built carefully and deliberately across 50 years of public life. But it was his daughter who knew him. And it took losing him to finally give her permission to say it out loud. The legend was real, but the man behind it was something far more important than the world deserved to know, until Danilee gave it to us. If this revelation left you shocked, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that will blow your mind. Comment below. What do you make of this secret finally coming to light? Some truths are only just beginning to be uncovered.